This is Tom Green from the National Weather Service in Raleigh with the Tropical Cyclones Presentation Online 2025. First off, I always think it's very important for everybody to know what office it is that covers where they are in North Carolina itself. So the Raleigh office ends up covering 31 counties in the central part of North Carolina. However, there are 6 other offices that end up covering some portion of the state of North Carolina. The Morristown, Tennessee office has the 2 westernmost counties, Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Roanoke, Virginia, Wakefield, Virginia, Newport, North Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina cover the rest of the state of North Carolina. So if you are looking to receive your specific forecast, whether it's on a day-to-day basis or for any sort of tropical cyclones, this is showing you which county covers your particular area. The 2025 Atlantic tropical cyclone names, we have Fernand out in the northern Atlantic. That is forecast to become a post-tropical cyclone later tonight. The next named storm that we would end up having would be Gabrielle. So the broad outline for the presentation, we're going to go over a climatology of hurricanes. We'll talk about different National Hurricane Center products, talk about the hazards associated with tropical cyclones in general, and finally talk about preparedness. So climatology. The hurricane season in the North Atlantic runs from June 1st to November 30th. Now that we're approaching the peak of the season, which is typically early to pretty much mid-September. That's why we normally have this presentation in the second half of August as we are approaching the peak of the season. Won't read you all of the statistics here on the screen. The average date of the first hurricane is August 10th. The average date of the first major hurricane is September 4th. However, we've already had that with Aaron before September 4th. And the average date of the last named storm is November 23rd. Again, this is a different way of looking at it. The y-axis, the vertical axis, is looking at the number of storms per 100 years, and you can end up seeing that that peak ends up occurring right around September 10th. For any type of named system hurricanes and tropical storms in the red, or the yellow just showing hurricanes. And even though the official hurricane season is June 1st to November 30th, I guess I should have tweaked the wording on the right side that should say tropical systems can occur from May through December. You can certainly see that there have been some systems in December, and we've even had 1 or 2 years where the system continued into January, although that is very rare. So the National Hurricane Center ends up putting out their cone, which represents the probable path of the center of the storm. That's very important to emphasize. The cone is the probable path of the center of the storm. The cone is not showing the impacts, and impacts can occur hundreds of miles from the center of the storm. Certainly with Hurricane Aaron, as it ended up moving through the Atlantic Ocean last week between the continental United States and Bermuda, was generating rip currents and high waves along the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. So in that sense, even though the cone did not go through the East Coast itself, those impacts were certainly being noted on the Atlantic seaboard. The center of the storm passes within the cone roughly 2/3 of the time. So you will always see the storm forecast having the path in the cone. However, if you were to track the cone over time, you would see that sometimes the storm ends up wandering outside of the cone of a previous forecast. And so in that sense, the cone shows you what the average error is. The fact that the cone ends up changing sizes based on how well the forecasts have done in recent history. So again, the tropical cyclone track forecast cone watches and warnings. You can end up seeing the areas under watches and warnings. In this particular image, you can see everything. The legend for those watches and warnings is at the bottom, the pink, yellow, red, and blue. That was going on across much of the Caribbean, although there were no watches or warnings for the continental United States. To form the cone, a set of imaginary circles are placed along the forecast track at each forecast interval. And again, the size of each circle encloses 2/3 of the previous 5 years official forecast errors. The cone is formed by connecting the areas swept out by all of those circles. And the scheduled issuance for these is at 5 and 11 a.m. and p.m. And I should have been a little bit more specific with that. That is specifically during daylight time. When we go back to standard time, it is 4 and 10 a.m. and p.m. These forecasts are actually issued on Zulu time, UTC time, Greenwich Mean Time, all of which are equivalent. There's an experimental forecast cone graphic that was being tested out last season that is also being tested out this season as well. This is from Hurricane Helene, showing the forecast as it was, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And so the legacy graphic, the one that has been around for many years, is shown on the left-hand side. And this specifically focused on showing what the watches and warnings were along the immediate coastline itself. However, what is being tested experimentally is to show what the inland watches and warnings are. So this shows a much different picture looking at the experimental graphic on the right-hand side. And certainly at this time, you can end up seeing that there was the hurricane warning for portions of Florida and Georgia. You can see a large extent of a tropical storm warning. You can see the tropical storm watch that extended all the way into Western North Carolina at this point. And there is even a small area near Tampa that is simultaneously under a hurricane watch and a tropical storm warning. So this is an experimental graphic that the National Hurricane Center is now in its second year of testing out. And they're getting feedback from the public, from partners, and seeing what the usefulness is of this and whether they will continue to issue this type of forecast as well. So again, I talked about the track errors. This is showing what the track errors are by different decades at different time periods. So in the 60s, a 72-hour forecast had an average error of 400 miles, or a little bit larger than 400 miles. And you can see that as we've gone through the decades, that 72-hour, the 3-day forecast has dramatically improved over time, that between 2010 and 2020, that average error that once was 400 miles is now down to 72 miles, or down to 100 miles. And that in the 2010s, a 7-day forecast had an average error of 300 miles. Now that forecast has remained internal to the National Hurricane Center. We don't see it at the local offices. The official forecasts only go out 5 days. I have not heard anything proposed as to when the National Hurricane Center may make their day 6 and day 7 forecasts public. But even at the local offices, that is not something that we have access to. And so what are those numbers? As I said, the radius of the cone changes each year, normally just by a couple of miles, but that cone does change every year. So for the 2025 hurricane season, the 72-hour average forecast error is 100 nautical miles. And at 120 hours, at a 5-day forecast, that radius is 213 nautical miles. So again, the center of the storm is expected to fall within 100 miles of the official forecast 3 days out, 2/3 of the time. So the error of the National Hurricane Center forecast is essentially built into the cone. That's the reason that we tell people to never focus directly on the line or the exact spot that is shown, to focus on the cone itself, because again, that is where the center of the storm could go and the impacts are going to be even over a greater area. So this is a graphic showing how the forecast cone has ended up changing over time. So you can see that difference between 2005 and 2020 for a storm at any particular location, how the accuracy has improved. And again, what that built-in error is showing, that the cone has shrunk over that 15-year time period. So how far have we come? The difference in the average 3-day track forecasts for Hurricane Floyd in 1999 and Dorian in 2019. That's a much smaller circle that you can end up seeing with those 3-day forecasts. So all of that was talking about the track forecast. Now this is going to end up focusing on the intensity forecast trends. And you can see that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s, there really hasn't been that much improvement in a 3-day forecast. And again, the intensity here is in knots. That's nautical miles per hour. And so again, in that sense, there has been a fairly good improvement in the 2010s. And again, that 144, 168, those are internal forecasts only to the National Hurricane Center. But you can see that once we end up getting to about 48 hours, the intensity air is relatively steady at somewhere between 10 and 15 knots through the rest of the official forecast itself. Now, taking a look, how do we classify different stages of these systems? So tropical depression is something that has a closed surface circulation, as opposed to sometimes we talk about an open wave where we can't see that everything is completely closed off in a circular fashion. So it must be closed off, and it is less than 39 miles an hour. The tropical storm gains a name when it has a sustained wind speed of 39 to 73 miles an hour. A hurricane is 74 miles an hour or greater, and a major hurricane is when we have a category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane, and that's when the wind speed is 111 miles an hour or greater. The Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale is used to categorize hurricane strength and to give an estimate of potential property damage. It is very important to note the Saffir-Simpson scale is only based on the wind speed. It is not based on the central pressure of the storm. It is not based on storm surge. It is not based on the amount of rainfall that is forecast to occur with the storm. The Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale only relates to the wind speeds themselves. So again, a category 1 storm is 74 to 95 miles an hour. Very dangerous winds will produce some strong damage. Once you end up getting to category 4 and category 5 storms, catastrophic damage will occur from the winds. Again, this does not account for rain. It does not account for storm surge. It does not account for the central pressure of the storm itself. What is the return period for a hurricane in different locations? So this is saying that at a particular location, how often on average is it between a hurricane, again, 64 knots, 74 mile an hour winds occurring at a particular place? So if we look at Key West, on average, a hurricane will end up moving through that area approximately every 8 years. If you're out at Cape Hatteras, it's approximately every 5 years. And again, Mother Nature doesn't remember where the paths of previous hurricanes were. So this certainly doesn't mean that if you have one hurricane, that means you're good for another 5 years. These are just average statistics. You can see as we end up getting into Maine, it's 20, 30, 40, 50 years between some of those areas having a hurricane moving through their area. A major hurricane certainly occurs less frequently. But again, you can end up seeing Southeast Florida ends up having a major hurricane on average, the most frequently, every 14 years. Cape Hatteras isn't that much behind with 16. And then we do see some other places sticking out along southeastern Louisiana and right along the Alabama-Florida border. If you're listening to this webinar from Maine, you probably don't have to worry about seeing too many major hurricanes. The new 1991 to 2020 seasonal averages, I guess they aren't new anymore if they went into effect 4 years ago. But this ends up showing that between 1981 and 2010 to 1991 to 2020, the average climatology, we typically end up using 30 years for climatology statistics, and we redo those numbers every 10 years, shows that now the average season has 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So the major hurricanes didn't change, but we're noticing a slight trend upward in the number of named storms, and on average, 1 additional hurricane a year. And certainly some of that can be attributed to the overall improvement in the observing platforms that we have. certainly as satellite coverage, the satellite coverage hasn't improved since 2010, but the resolution of the satellite imagery has improved. So we can see as much ocean as we could before, but now the data that we have is of a higher resolution. It could also be due to the warming ocean and atmosphere, which are influenced by climate change as well. The National Hurricane Center ended up doing an Atlantic hurricane season outlook in May. This is their update as of August 7th. They're now saying that there is approximately a 50% chance of an above normal season when it comes to the number of named storms and hurricanes, a 35% chance of near normal, and a 15% chance of below normal numbers. And again, the numbers on the right are the range of what they are expecting will likely happen. And again, 13 to 18 named storms and 5 to 9 hurricanes, that would certainly end up a normal year of 14, 7, and 3 would end up fitting in all of this forecast right here. Now let's take a look at some of the National Hurricane Center products. So the National Weather Service, the National Hurricane Center, as part of that, are working together. The National Hurricane Center, located in Miami, Florida, forecasts the track and the intensity of the storm itself. And they are looking at all of the tropical cyclones around North America. So they are looking in the Atlantic Basin as well as the Pacific Basin. They are located in Miami, Florida, and as you can see from those statistics in the bottom left, they have a lot of things to make sure that that building can withstand a very strong hurricane. On the right is showing our building, the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it is our job to forecast the impacts and the threats for everybody in our local area, looking at our 31 counties. We end up working together with the National Hurricane to decide when and where watches and warnings are issued. So the tropical weather outlook is issued at separate times from when particular storms are updated. So if the storms themselves are updated at 5 and 11 a.m. and p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, tropical weather outlook is issued at 2 and 8 a.m. and p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And it is looking at what they think is the tropical cyclone formation potential for the next 7 days. So this is an image from approximately 2 years ago where it was showing Tropical Storm Emily and Tropical Depression 6. And then there were 3 areas highlighted in orange and red where there was the potential for systems to end up developing over the next 7 days. A hurricane watch is when sustained winds of 74 miles an hour or higher are possible within a specified area within 48 hours. While a tropical storm watch is going to be the sustained winds of 39 or 73 miles an hour possible within the specified area within 48 hours itself. So again, the watch phase is looking 48 hours out for these products, while the warning phase is typically within the next 36 hours. So as you might expect, a hurricane warning is when sustained winds of 74 miles an hour or higher are expected within the specified area in the next 36 hours. Tropical storm warning is when sustained winds of tropical storm strength are expected within the next 36 hours. There has been a change to potential tropical cyclone advisories. These have existed for a couple of years. A potential tropical cyclone is when something hasn't closed off yet. We don't have that closed circulation, but there is high confidence of it developing and bringing significant wind or storm surge impacts to land. Previously, these advisories could be issued up to 48 hours prior to the arrival of storm surge or tropical storm force winds reaching land. And now in 2025, the change has been made that these advisories can be issued up to 72 hours. Again, not stating that something has formed. Tropical storm, hurricane, and storm surge watches are all still 48 hours and 36 hours for warnings. But the advisories themselves are just saying that there is the potential for something to develop. Last year we had, I believe it was potential tropical cyclone 8 that ended up moving across eastern North Carolina. And we ended up having plenty of rain across our area from that. But a closed circulation never ended up developing. So it was never a named storm. And here's an example from 2023, where in the upper left-hand corner that was showing potential tropical cyclone 9 at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time on Monday. By 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time on Monday, 6 hours later, it was Tropical Depression 9. And 9 hours after that, it had strengthened to 45 miles an hour. And so it became named. It was Tropical Storm Harold. So again, those products were able to start being issued at 10 a.m. Central Time, as opposed to having to wait until it was a named storm at 1 a.m. on Tuesday. The key messages graphic is issued by the National Hurricane Center. It combines key messages from the technical discussion that the National Hurricane Center issues, along with pertinent advisory graphics. So in this particular one, they decided to show the cone of where the storm was expected to move, in addition to the rainfall forecast. These graphics are available via the National Hurricane Center social media accounts and also on the National Hurricane Center website itself. Another one of the graphics that they will end up producing is the earliest reasonable arrival time. And so this can be considered a reasonable worst case scenario. And in general, it's a rule of thumb that says that people want to make sure that all of their preparations are complete by the time that tropical storm force winds would arrive. So again, this is not showing the peak of the winds. This is showing the earliest the tropical storm force winds could end up showing up. And again, while times are given, especially farther out, you want to think in more general terms. So don't look at this map and say Wednesday 8 p.m. or Thursday 8 a.m. Think late Wednesday or early Thursday. This is not trying to pinpoint anything to a particular hour. These graphics can be used in conjunction with the most likely arrival time. And so this is the most likely scenario. And these are purposely two different storms. And so this is showing a most likely scenario as to when the tropical storm force winds would arrive. So again, if this is showing the earliest time of arrival, you really want to make sure that your preparations are complete by this time, because this is as early as the storm might arrive, but this is when it would be more specifically expected to arrive. So again, just putting all of this on the same slide. Again, not the same storm that I was showing you before, but you want to be very certain that your preparations are complete by the earliest reasonable time, and absolutely you need to have everything completed by the most likely arrival time. All right, now let's take a look at some of the hazards. Tropical cyclones can produce much more than just wind themselves. You can have heavy rainfall, flooding, storm surge, rip currents if you're along the coast. For those last two, wind and tornadoes. So we'll touch on each of these a little bit here. Water is certainly what ends up killing with tropical cyclone fatalities. Again, this study was published 11 years ago. It is not the most recent and up to date, but over a 50-year period, you can see that nearly half of the United States tropical cyclone fatalities occurred from storm surge alone. And then the rain itself was another 27%, and the surf another 6%. So you can see that water is certainly what is the hazard that is killing most people when it comes to tropical cyclones. If we look back at Hurricane Florence, at the time of this forecast, the hurricane was about 200 miles east to southeast of Wilmington. The color scales are the same on these two images, so you can see that this was a very good forecast in showing those light purples and those dark purples immediately along the coast, and certainly that there was some banding that occurred with the rain. And despite these excellent forecasts, 16 out of 17 flood-related fatalities that occurred were people in vehicles. So you always need to be safe when you're in your vehicle. You don't want to drive into flooded roadways. We always say turn around, don't drown. Whether it's a hurricane, whether it's localized flash flooding from thunderstorms, anything like that. Hurricane Lorenzo was the second deadliest 2019 Atlantic Basin storm. It remained well out to sea, but you can see that there were 8 rip current fatalities in the United States itself. So again, even though there was no rain, no direct wind impacts on the United States from Hurricane Lorenzo itself, there were still, unfortunately, fatalities from this storm, that people in the water still were in danger. And the dangerous rip currents can occur well ahead of approaching storms, or even this storm that ended up remaining very far away from the United States itself. Beach safety. We always end up telling people that the best way to get out of a rip current is to swim parallel to the shore. You don't want to try and fight the rip current itself, which is likely going to be trying to take you out farther into the water. You don't want to end up fighting against that. Very strong rip currents can be faster than Michael Phelps as a swimmer. The best way to end up getting out of a rip current is they are normally narrow. And so you want to see is you want to swim parallel to the shore so that you can end up getting away from the rip current itself and end up getting to something that would be that would have less flow going on. So you want to make sure that you swim out of the current and then end up swimming to shore. Tornadoes are certainly another threat with any sort of tropical cyclone, a tropical storm, or hurricane. These typically occur on the right side of the storm. This is the side where the winds are tending to blow onshore, bringing warm, moist tropical air inland. As the hurricane is making landfall, friction slows the winds close to the surface. The water, it has less friction over it. And so when the wind ends up getting to the land, the wind kind of piles up in some extent. The wind kind of catches up to itself. While higher up in the storm, the winds are still spinning much quicker. And so when you have increasing wind speed with height, this is a favorable wind profile for tornadoes to form. Tornadoes spawn from tropical systems are rarely accompanied by lightning and even more rarely associated with hail. They normally occur very quickly. They will spin up very quickly. They likely will not last very long, which makes them that much harder to predict. So again, as I was saying, in this particular storm, if this storm was moving from the southeast to the northwest, that right front quadrant would be what is coming into North Carolina. And so all the areas in that red box would be the more favorable location for the development of tornadoes. This is not looking at Hurricane Helene, but this is looking at Tropical Storm Debby, which was a tropical storm over South Carolina. By the time it moved over North Carolina, it had weakened to a tropical depression. The color coding across the state showing the amount of rain that ended up occurring. And then the individual dots are showing the confirmed tornadoes that ended up occurring. So there were 10 confirmed tornadoes in North Carolina alone, including an EF3 tornado to the east of Raleigh, which unfortunately did result in a fatality. That was, I don't remember the exact wind speed of that. That was a long night. I was working that night along with one of my coworkers several of us were keeping an eye on the radar, and we had a tornado warning on that storm 30 minutes in advance, but unfortunately there was still a fatality from it. The hurricanes, threats, and impacts products. Again, these are issued between our local office and the National Hurricane Center itself. The wind threat is shown on the left-hand side. This is taking a look at 4 different hurricane threats and impacts. So wind, storm surge, flooding, and tornado threat. So again, with this particular storm, I can't say that I remember which storm this is. There's color coding with that purple showing the potential for a major hurricane along the southern and western portions of Florida. The red in that image was showing the potential for hurricane force winds. Anything in the yellow and orange was showing the potential for at least tropical storm force winds. So these graphics, the storm surge is obviously contained just to the immediate coastline itself. But certainly over central North Carolina, we could end up seeing what the wind threat is, the flooding rain threat, and the tornado threat. And the wind threat is something that we are discussing specifically with the National Hurricane Center. The storm surge threat is primarily a National Hurricane Center product. The flooding rain is the National Hurricane Center in collaboration with the Weather Prediction Center, which is another national office, part of the National Weather Service. And finally, the tornado threat is in collaboration with the Storm Prediction Center, which is what is normally predicting our severe thunderstorm and tornado threat year-round. What are the local time zones in National Hurricane Center products? So as I said, the local time when the National Hurricane Center issues an advisory at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, that might be Central AM, 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time in the Central Time Zone. Much of the Atlantic Time Zone remains in Standard Time. So it is 11 a.m. Atlantic Standard, while it is 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The storms are farther up in the North Atlantic. It might also be under Greenwich Mean Time, or it might be under Cape Verde time. Looking at our local weather forecast office tropical web pages, you can go to weather.gov/RAH/tropical. This is going to be your one-stop shop for all tropical related local forecast information. The active storms tab becomes active when the National Hurricane Center initiates tropical cyclone advisories. The Eastern region and Southern region offices typically have pages that are similar, although some offices have slightly different formats to them. Again, you can end up clicking on the threats and impacts tab, so we can end up seeing what those particular threats are. Again, we would not be showing any storm surge threat over Central North Carolina. This is from a Texas office, so that is showing the inland threat for that. Local products are going to be focused on a local storm that's going on. The entire text of a hurricane local statement can be viewed here. We are going to touch about what a hurricane local statement is in a minute. Again, satellite and radar data are always available. And then there's also a preparedness tab that's always available, and that will show you quick access to local evacuation maps, preparedness guides, and videos. So I was focusing more on a broader scale of the National Hurricane Center itself. Now the products that we are issuing as the local forecast office. What details can you reasonably expect from a hurricane forecast at different lead time? Well, locally at our office, we're really only working on 7-day forecasts. Anything past that, it's going to be a very broad idea about where something might develop or affect. So sometimes we're just going to end up saying some rumor control about what the Hurricane Center is saying from a broad perspective, what the Climate Prediction Center is saying from a broad perspective. Even in the 5 to 7 day period, we aren't going to try and get into a lot of details. A lot of times we're just trying to say a broad sense of what might end up occurring with a storm. We're going to try and start narrowing things down in a 3 to 5 day perspective, and then it really is in that 1 to 2 day perspective that we're going to try and start saying the potential impacts to specific areas and specific onset times. The Hazardous Weather Outlook is a product that we always issue year-round. This is always looking at a threat for what we see as potentially hazardous weather as far as 7 days out. This one, again, this was a product issued on a Tuesday looking about Hurricane Florence approaching Wednesday through Friday, so it did not get specific. It said it was forecast to be a very powerful and major hurricane as it approached the southeast United States. This hazardous weather outlook was in effect for all 31 of our central North Carolina counties. We weren't getting specific and saying that Sampson County was under a threat and Forsyth County was not. It was just still looking at a broad sense. Tropical cyclone local watch and warning statements. These are a good source of meteorological threats and impacts for people looking at a smaller scale. This is what drives the emergency alert system, NOAA weather radio, the watch and warning display on weather.gov websites, and wireless emergency alerts, also known as WEAs or WEAs. You automatically should be receiving WEAs on your phones for all tornado warnings. You would receive them for high-end severe thunderstorm warnings. You would receive them for high-end flash flood warnings. However, the tropical cyclone local watch and warning statement is not a good source of information or media for media or others who are requiring the big picture. So again, this example is looking at Cumberland County, looking at the locations affected, Fayetteville and Fort Bragg, saying that the latest local forecast was the equivalent of tropical storm force winds with the potential for strong tropical storm force winds, but not looking at hurricane force winds, and that the wind threat had decreased from the previous assessment. This is in comparison to the hurricane local statement, which is a concise summary of significant potential impacts from a tropical cyclone for the forecast area of responsibility. It is a good source of information for the media and others who require the big picture. It is not a source of meteorological and threat information for those who deal on a smaller scale. And it is not a source of official watch and warning information. So the sample of this is something that was issued by the Raleigh office for Hurricane Florence, but it's not looking at a specific area. It is still focusing on our 31 county area as a whole. Again, the new information, there were no changes to watches and warnings with this particular product. It said that there were 2 counties under a hurricane warning. So in that sense, it is somewhat specific, but it isn't trying to focus just on Sampson County or just on Wayne County, considering it ends up listing another 14 counties that are under a tropical storm warning as well. These products, the hurricane local statements, are issued by all of the forecast offices in green. Over time, these have been issued farther and farther inland. So in that sense, San Diego ended up being impacted a couple of years ago, and they had the capability to issue hurricane local statements. But again, much of the eastern United States and the southern United States, along with some offices that are not in the continental United States as well. I mentioned wireless emergency alerts a minute ago, a WEA. Again, I mentioned that all tornado warnings end up having a wireless emergency alert message issued with them. Some flash flood warnings, not all of them. Hurricane warnings, we certainly should not have to worry about a tsunami warning around here. These are configurable on most smartphones, whether you want to receive them or not. I believe it is typically located in a menu likely near your Amber alerts as well. So you can customize whether or not you receive Amber alerts. You can customize whether or not you want to receive wireless emergency alerts as well. You can also see our hourly forecast at any time if you go to weather.gov/Raleigh. You can click on point on our homepage itself, and then you can choose to turn on or off any of those click boxes. You can end up seeing things in a digital readout with the actual numbers along the bottom left. The default is the bottom right. So again, you're seeing a trace. That top line in red is the temperature. The green line is the dew point. Below that is showing the surface wind. It is showing the tails to the down and left. That is always showing the direction the wind is coming from. So that is a southwesterly wind. That means the wind is coming from the southwest and is blowing towards the northeast, with a small period of gusts expected Tuesday afternoon. If we go lower down, the green is the relative humidity, the brown is the potential for precipitation, and the blue is the sky cover. And then again, the very bottom was showing the chance for rainfall. If you also go to weather.gov/forecast points, you can end up picking a location on a map or typing in latitude and longitude. It is color coded for different weather types. You can see a summary of the entire week all at once. It will end up showing you a severe thunderstorm outlook as long as the excessive rainfall outlook. And you can end up seeing detailed hourly table and graphics for the next 7 days. Finally, I want to touch on preparedness a little bit. It's always best to prepare for hurricanes before the hurricane season begins, or prepare now when we don't have anything that we need to worry about locally. You'll want to develop an evacuation plan. You'll want to assemble disaster supplies, food, water, batteries, charger for your phone or any other electronics that you might need to charge, a radio, they can still end up receiving FM and AM broadcasts. You would likely also want to make sure that you have some additional cash on hand, because if the power is out, you may not be able to go to an ATM to get any cash, or your credit cards may not be accepted somewhere. You want to check your insurance and document the possessions that you have. You'll want to create a communication plan with a handwritten list of contacts to make sure that you can contact those people that you need to, and again, not be relying on the electronics that you have. And you might want to consider strengthening your home. More things to consider before the storm. Again, determine your risk, what you would be at risk for, assemble your supplies, strengthen your home. Help your neighbor out. Make sure that your neighbors have a chance to evacuate. Check in on them after the storm ends up passing. And it's good to have a written plan. Have at least one contact outside of the impact area of the storm, and share your plan with trusted family and friends that they know what you're planning to do. Again, more things that you can end up doing. Develop a disaster supply kit. You likely would want to make sure that you would have enough for 7 days worth of food and water. Supplies for your infants and pets. Want to make sure you have blankets, pillows, clothing, personal items. You would like to have a no-weather radio or an AM/FM radio, again, battery powered in case your power is out long term. Charge a cell phone and an extra battery. You may decide to rely on your traditional landline telephone. And again, those ATMs probably won't be working if there's a widespread power outage. Once a hurricane watch is issued, again, that is the potential for hurricane winds within 48 hours. You'll want to monitor your no-weather radio or local media, get that disaster supply kit ready, and make sure you have gas for whatever your vehicle is. Bring in outdoor objects that you can bring inside. If you can't bring something outside, you'll want to tie it down. Board up your windows, turn your fridge and your freezer to the coldest settings, and just make sure that if the power goes out, you can keep whatever perishable items you have as cold as long as possible. Decide where you're going to go if you evacuate. Make sure that you have enough time to get there. You may have a lot of company along those evacuation routes, and the hotels likely fill quickly along the major interstates. So again, this is the reason for you to have a plan for what you want to do in advance. Again, the hurricane warnings are generally, if you are less than 36 hours before the impact, you're going to want to continue to monitor your no-weather radio and your local media. If you're closer to the coast, you may need to evacuate, and you certainly want to listen to those evacuations. If you decide to evacuate, turn off your main water and gas. If you're in a storm surge zone, again, any of your indoor items and furniture, you're going to want to get them as high as possible. If you decide your home is your best shelter, you're going to want to stay away from the exterior walls and windows. Keep as many flashlights and batteries as possible near you. And as the storm gets near, follow the same safety rules that you would for a tornado, especially considering the hurricanes can end up producing tornadoes. After the storm itself, you want to continue to monitor all of the available media sources. Don't return home until advised by the authorities. Be prepared to assist injured people. Stay away from any downed power lines and report these to officials. You don't know if power is still going through these power lines themselves. You want to be alert for wild animals that may have been forced from their homes as well. They are probably not too happy that the storm ended up coming through either. And make sure that any food that you ended up having in your refrigerator or your freezer hasn't spoiled before you consume it. Take photos of storm damage before altering it for insurance purposes. If your home is damaged, you'll want to open up doors and windows to make sure that you ventilate things and to dry out your home. Be alert for any gas leaks, electrical system damage, and sewer and water line issues. Finally, I want to talk about Skywarn and amateur radio. Amateur radio operators who are also Skywarn spotters collect reports of severe and hazardous weather for the National Weather Service. These Skywarn nets are self-activating for severe thunderstorm watches and warnings, and tropical weather events, and tornado watches. And we get several reports from our Skywarn and amateur radio users. So for the Central Carolina Skywarn, they are one of 2 Weather Service designated Skywarn programs to serve the National Weather Service in Raleigh. Spotters with a ham radio license can make reports via the Central Carolina Skywarn net. The primary repeater and the backup numbers are on there as well. Virginia is the emergency coordinator. And again, you can see where the Central Carolina Skywarn Facebook page is. That is on your screen here. Central Carolina Skyborne does weekly practice nets every Tuesday night at 9:15 p.m. And these are also streamed over broadcastify.com. You can also receive more information at centralcarolinaskyborne.net. In addition, there is a Triad Skyborne program as well that is serving the Triad region of Central North Carolina. Again, you can see the Ashbro repeater listed there, and John Hamilton is the emergency coordinator. And you can receive more information on the Triad Skyborne at triadskyborne.blogspot.com. I want to thank different people who have made contributions to this presentation, including Chris Strong at the Sterling, Virginia office, Eric Heaton at the Morehead City, North Carolina office, Jesse Smith at the Melbourne, Florida office, Southern Region headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, and Chrissy Anderson here at the Raleigh, North Carolina office.